What do we want? Safe food! When do we want it? Now!
GM technology allows us to do things that we could never dream about 50 years ago.
Don't let GMOs into the country.
There's no one answer for GM. It's like driving a car. There are good drivers and bad drivers.
We're still relatively safe here in Ireland, but we're really at a critical point where it could go either way.
Take scorpion venom being put into a cabbage plant. Without doubt, it's a brave new world we've entered into.
GM technology in agriculture remains the most contentious issue at the heart of the environment movement today. Many environmentalists believe that this technology is detrimental to the environment and that science is being used as a tool by big industry to monopolize our crops.
Yet many scientists consider genetically modified technology to be hugely important to our continued survival.
But does this issue have to be so polarized?
In this episode, I'm going on a journey to discover just exactly what GM technology is, the effect of genetically modified crops on agriculture, and the possibilities for the future of food production. It's estimated that global population will increase to between 9 and 10 billion by 2050, and that world food production will have to double to feed this population. Yet impacts of climate change are projected to have devastating effects on global food output in this century. Finding ways to avoid this global disaster will be a huge issue for all of us in coming decades.
So what's the way forward? How are we going to produce enough crops to feed the world's growing population? And how are these crops going to adapt to a drastically changing world?
Genetically modified soybeans, maize, cotton, and canola dominate global biotech agriculture. The United States accounts for 60% of the global land area planted with GM crops, and approximately 75% of processed foods in the US contain genetically engineered ingredients. So what exactly is GMO? I'm here at the Botanic Gardens in Dublin to find out.
A GMO is a genetically modified organism. And what it means is that using gene technology, we can now insert a gene from one species and put it in a completely different species, or sometimes just between two cultivars of the same species of plant, or animal for that matter.
So what are the advantages of GM?
GM provides us with the opportunity to accelerate enormously breeding programs that in the past would have taken 10, 15, if not 20 years to develop, but we can also now take genes out of a scorpion, a crab, a pig, and likewise put these into plants. It's an extraordinary thought that we are manipulating genes from completely different kingdoms of life on Earth. And the consequence of that is often very difficult to predict. These are very beguiling things. It is in almost the realms of science fiction, the idea that you're putting different characteristics from one organism into another. Now, what is driving that technology varies. Sometimes one could argue, well, this is to benefit the farmer. It is to benefit mankind generally, or is it simply to benefit shareholders in a company that is creating these organisms? And I think one of the great problems we face today in understanding GMOs is what is the motivation behind it? Do we know how safe it is? And what are the potential consequences?
Here at the Earth Institute in UCD, genetic engineering plays an important role in research.
So the majority of my work is not directly in GM, but we use GM as a technology to prove the function of genes. So for example, putting a mammalian gene into wheat, for example, would be what we'd call a transgenic plant. There is another case where you put genes from closer relatives, that's called cisgenic. So for example, putting a gene from wild wheat relative into wheat is a cisgenic. So there's two different categories of GMO.
So the two different types are transgenic or cisgenic. Transgenic is when the plant animal or microorganism is bred with a gene from another species. And cisgenic is when the modified organism is bred with genes from varieties of the same species.
So what are the main benefits of GM crops?
Global map of crop production is changing dramatically. You have increased temperatures, for example, in South America, so you need crops that are more heat tolerant. You have increased salination of soil, so you need crops that are salt tolerant, etc. So all of those are very worth investigating and looking at. These are the type of cells you put your gene into at this stage. You use one of two technologies, a bacteria to get foreign DNA in, or what's called a gene gun to shoot it in. So here you have a tobacco plant growing at an advanced stage, and it's put into a specialised media which induces root formation and induces shoot formation. To make a GM tobacco is very easy compared to wheat.
Over in the Department of Science's Horticultural Lab, they're involved in field trials of disease-resistant crops such as wheat, barley and oats.
In Ireland, Jimmy, are we eating GM foods?
We import boatloads of GM material every week into the country and have been doing so for the last 20 years. And all the products that are produced from using that material have been on our supermarket shelves for 20 years.
While we don't have commercial GM crops here in Ireland, our livestock industry relies on imported GM soya for feedstock. But Gavin Lynch, an organic farmer, gets his feedstock from non-GM sources.
So how many cows have you got here?
We have about 20 cows here, Duncan,
Yeah.
and everything that follows on from them then to finished beef.
So what's the difference now between your cattle here, the beef from your cattle, and that's what's produced from conventional beef?
We manage them in such a way that they're on a clean grazing rotation. We don't need to dose them, and so the whole process is natural from start to finish.
So when you look at genetically modified crops, how do you feel about that?
They're actually an unnecessary and probably a dangerous distraction from some of the real serious issues that we're facing in terms of biodiversity loss and climate change. GM fundamentally changes the building blocks of life. What we do here is we try and farm as close to nature as we can with as low an impact as we possibly can on the environment. What GM is about producing food in monocultures. It's about industrial scale food production, and I think that's definitely, it's not the way forward for global agriculture.
So you can see what a small farmer like Gavin is doing here, as close to nature as it can get and producing high quality food, but with the big issues coming down the track with food security and climate change and population growth. Can small farmers like this survive, and can they produce the food that is required to feed the planet?
So we've heard what a genetically modified organism is and how they can be cisgenic or transgenic. But in the debate on genetic manipulation of plants, BT crops comes in for a lot of criticism.
The present situation in Europe is only BT maize is approved for planting. It's grown in 7 countries in over a total of 100,000 hectares, and mostly here in Spain.
If GM research is crucial to helping us feed the world, I'd like to find out exactly how it improves the quality of plant production. Here in the University of Leida, they're involved in plant trials of transgenic, conventional and BT maize. About 2/3 of the maize grown here in Catalonia is BT maize. It contains a gene that comes from a soil bacterium, Bacillus thuringiensis. When this BT gene is introduced to the maize, the plant becomes resistant to the corn borer worm and therefore reduces the need for farmers to use chemicals and pesticides.
Okay, oh, excellent. Nice. Here you can see
you can see the corn border.
Oh, right, that's them there, okay.
There's plenty of them. Plenty, you can see the holes, you can see everywhere. And there are different types, there are 2 different species of this kind of worms. In other areas of Europe, you don't have this kind of worms. Here there is mainly one difference. This is a normal corn cob. A corn cob, excellent corn cob, because you can see that it's an almost perfect cob.
And is that BT or not BT?
I would say 90% sure BT.
Why?
Because there is no any corn border.
No beetles on it?
No beetles. BT here in our areas saves about 10 to 20% of the production.
With this technology being so new, I wonder what the long-term effects of growing these crops will be.
Hi.
How are you?
Nice to meet you. Thanks for coming all over to my little...
Henk Hobbelink is coordinator of GRAIN, an international collective that supports small farmers.
With global population, expanding at such a rate and food security becoming a big issue, can we sort out food in this way? Can we use small holdings and will it be able to feed 9.5 billion by 2050?
The first conclusion we have to draw is that small farmers now, which small farmers in the world, across the world, all of them produce organically. Those farmers who have not yet gone to the pesticide market, to the fertilizer market, they produce 70 to 80% of all the food in the world. The problem is where industrial agriculture comes in. We see in the countries you work that in a lot of cases, when the big plantations come in, they produce commodity crops, they produce soybean, they produce things people don't eat. These are not crops to feed the world. These are crops which feed, in the case, for example, of maize and soybean, to feed an animal industry here in Europe. 80% of all the GMOs are grown in 4 countries, 4 to 5 countries. The US, Canada, Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay. Those are the main, and these are all in high industrial conditions. That's an important thing to realize because that's not where the hungry people are. But the main problem behind this as well is, apart from the technical issue itself, is that what we do with these BT maize is these are less than a handful of companies who control the world supply of these seeds. If we do this here in Spain, we allow it in Ireland, in Ethiopia, in Ghana, in all over the world, the whole world will be dominated by this handful of varieties produced by a handful of companies. That's for us a major concern, that we cannot hand over the food supply at the global level to just a handful of especially chemical companies.
One minute I'm hearing from scientists how GM technology is benefiting agriculture. And the next minute, organic farmers are telling me it's not the way forward. It's all very confusing. But the bottom line surely must be the fight for food security in a vastly changing world. Today, I'm meeting some farmers from Lieda. Holy grows organic maize, but his fields are surrounded by BT GM maize.
This is the size he can produce here. Fantastic size. But you're an organic farmer, and you must be concerned now about issues with BT maize spreading contamination to your crops.
Jo ja he estat contaminat 4 vegades.
During 4 years, not successive, his production was contaminated with the pollen of the conventional.
Yeah, how do you feel about that?
A més, hi ha molt pocs agricultors orgànics a la comarca aquesta.
Before harvesting, the organic farmers have a checking on the production. When this checking has a result that the corn is not contaminated, then they can sell his production as organic. And if not, they have to sell his production as conventional. And this means half price.
Half price?
Half price.
Half price?
Half
that
price.
Much of a difference?
Holy's organic maize is planted much further apart than the BT maize crops surrounding his fields. But his organic maize cobs are much bigger.
The reason for that is that they cannot use herbicides. For this reason, have to enter in the field with machinery, and that means that the plant density is lower. So less plants per unit of area.
Andreu's BT maize produces smaller cobs, but in much higher density than chuli.
This a very big difference with an organic crop, because they have not the need to enter with the machinery to control the weeds.
Interestingly, the organic crop and the GM crop produces the same yield per hectare per year.
So, Andrea, why are you growing BT maize?
Per fer orgànic suposo que has de passar any.
Because they have to let minimum 2, 3 or 4 years the field cultivating with organic technologies in order to certify the production. So for him it's easier to produce BT.
Right. The BT maize is less labour intensive for the farmers, and they're confident of a good yield every single year. So I wonder what the future holds for farmers like Juli. He's the only organic farmer left in the entire region, and it's more than likely that his crop will become contaminated again and again. The majority of GM crops grown worldwide are either tolerant to the application of herbicides or produce their own pesticides, as in BT crops. But there are also publicly funded trials of transgenic crops that claim to produce more nutrients for human health.
This is an experimental transgenic field. It's a corn where the 6 genes has been introduced. It has 100 more times carotene. It's just to improve the nutrition.
Okay, so this is all for nutrition.
If you take a break, if you break the corn, if you take a seed of corn, the inside it's starch. It's starch, but starch has no or very little vitamins.
What Jaime's explained to me here is that these have 6 genes. One of them is tomato, another is carrot, but another one is crab from the ocean.
This is the basic idea, to improve the nutritional value in an areas where corn is the staple food.
I'm finding the biggest objection to GM is the control of GM seeds. A handful of big agrochemical monopolies hold the patents for many of these seeds. I'm concerned about how a vital renewable resource like a seed has become a non-renewable patented commodity. Surely this will have a negative impact on small-scale farmers all over the world. The Irish Seed Savers Association protects indigenous crops grown here by collecting and preserving our seeds.
One of the things that has happened with the global food system now is that we're increasingly going into monocultures, growing the same variety with no genetic variation. And that was very dangerous for us in the 1840s. We were only growing one variety of potato, predominantly the lumper variety. In Peru, in the Andes, where the potato originated, the farmer would have been growing at least 200 per field, 200 varieties of potato per field, out of a community resource of about 2,000. So genetic variability and seed variety stands between us and mass starvation.
These are Irish seeds, yes, and this single head represents thousands of seeds. So if you imagine if you were growing one leek and you allowed it to go to seed and you're producing thousands of seeds from it, that's just pretty amazing, the power of seed.
Absolutely.
From one single seed. This represents all the 800 varieties that we've saved in such a small room. So it takes, you feel the hairs on the back of your neck kind of lift up just to think that our food security exists in here, in this room.
Are we now on a pathway towards total unsustainability?
Well, it's very dangerous, and this is what I'm interested in, is the power and control and the increased monopolies of certain seed companies. Like 3 companies on the planet now control 90% of the grain supply globally. That's really dangerous. There's a risk when you put all your eggs in one basket. This is about the food we eat, that we all eat, and we need huge variety of genetic variability in our seed populations to actually increase our resistance and resilience as we face climate change. This seed bank here and this living library that we're standing in here will become very, very important to people. There is no big technological fix that's going to fix these problems. It's actually back to the earth we'll have to go. And that's why this is so important.
But the earth we must go back to is a very changed one from even 30 years ago. And it's not just GM crops that have changed it. In Europe, the stringent restrictions on the development and use of GMOs is changing. Here in Ireland, the Environmental Protection Agency are responsible for licensing and regulating their use. So Tom, what's actually licensed here in Ireland?
The EPA have licensed over 560 GMO users in Ireland. Most of those users would be working in contained use facilities, for example, laboratories around the country and third-level institutes, working on bacteria that produce antibiotics, working on viruses that produce vaccines, working on plant diseases like septoria on wheat, very important disease, and indeed working on potato blight fungus on potatoes.
So are GMO trials subject to controls here in Ireland?
In 2012, the EPA granted consent to Teagasc to carry out a small field trial, that is the cisgenic potato down in Oak Park in Carlow, and that trial is subject to very stringent conditions set by the Environmental Protection Agency.
What new GM techniques are coming down the track, and how are they going to be regulated?
Gene editing techniques, that is to say that scientists can turn a gene off or on in the plant without having to introduce any foreign DNA. So you have a scenario now where you have the progeny, or you could say an apple from an apple tree, that wouldn't contain any new DNA or protein. Big question we have now, will those apples be regulated as GMOs? The European Commission are actually banning a lot of plant protection products, and it's going to be harder for Irish farmers and farmers in the European Union to compete if we don't have a technology like GM. It's not a panacea. It's only one tool, I believe, in the plant breeder's toolbox, but I think we'd be crazy not to look at it.
Nine out of the top 10 global pharmaceutical companies have operations in Ireland. The industry employs 25,000 people and accounts for 50% of Irish exports. So is there much genetic engineering now in biopharma?
We can't make proteins synthetically. We need to use genetic engineering to get cells to make them for us. The cell itself acts as a factory and builds the protein for us.
So what new technologies are taking place now with genetic engineering in biopharma?
If you take a condition like hemophilia, where the patient is missing a particular protein that should be in your blood to allow your blood to clot, that was derived from other human blood. And we had some tragic incidences in the past where patients became infected from viruses that was in the blood of donors. Those blood factors are now made in bioreactors. That doesn't mean to say it's simple now, it's far from it. But for example, recent discoveries made in Canadian labs is that we can make a biopharmaceutical-based Ebola treatment using genetic engineering of tobacco plants, of all things. So the tobacco plants are infected with genes that express proteins that attack the Ebola virus.
Nearly everybody accepts that genetic engineering in medicine is really important. But when it comes to food and food crops, is there a big difference between the two?
So the basics are the same. We're ultimately manipulating the genetic makeup of different types of cells. The major difference, I suppose, is application. In the biopharmaceutical industry, it's contained use within some kind of lab environment. For agriculture, it's non-contained use.
GM technology has revolutionized medicine, but in agriculture, it's still wrapped up in controversy. Its role in addressing increased food production in a more volatile future climate is still in question.
Some of the great challenges we face are how are we going to stop the constant encroachment on rainforests and other habitats we're destroying for new agricultural land. We need to freeze that agricultural footprint. And at the same time, we want to rehabilitate soils that have been lost to agriculture through erosion and so forth. And certainly, companies who are driven by a profit motive, as they have to be, are not the best way of solving that problem. We need to be doing this for the common good of humanity. And that can only come from government-based research.